Hi Year 11, this video is going to focus on how Dickens presents the theme of poverty in A Christmas Carol. I've chosen this theme to explore in this video because it does tie in to lots of different themes within the novella, and it is a real central thread that runs all the way through. So it is important that you have an understanding of the context of the novel, and remember you are awarded marks for your understanding of context. Now it was set in Victorian England, Victorian London, and the gulf between the rich and the poor in Victorian England was absolutely huge. And it's really important that you have this understanding that Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol as an allegorical novel. He was angry. He was angry at the rich and he was angry at the church because, as you know, Charles Dickens' childhood, his dad went to prison for debt and he ended up working in a factory. So he was passionate about social reform and change, and he didn't want people to undergo the poverty that he had gone through as a young boy. Now you have looked at two main thinkers around the society in Victorian England. You've looked at Thomas Malthus. Now remember, Thomas Malthus said decrease the surplus population, and he believed that poverty, war and famine were actually a positive thing in our country at the time, because he believed that it would sort of wipe out the lower class of people who in his eyes weren't contributing to the economy. Now remember, surplus means extra, and Thomas Malthus was an economist, so it's important to remember that he was thinking about the financial impact of poorer people on our country. Now the surplus population are represented perfectly in this novella by the Cratchits. And remember, Dickens goes out of his way to give each Cratchit a name. They are all hard-working characters, and it's Dickens' way of showing us that poor people are not lazy. You will have also looked at an opposing view from Richard Osler, who was against workhouses. So Charles Dickens and Richard Osler shared similar beliefs. He thought that workhouses were prisons for the poor. So you've got these two contrasting thinkers, and it's really important when writing about A Christmas Carol that you hold the context in your head, and you've got the kind of clear idea that Dickens was writing A Christmas Carol and it served as a vehicle for him to give his moral message. So these are a couple of, I've called them golden nuggets, because you can drop them in almost any essay. And that's why I've chosen to start with looking at poverty, because coming together with your revision, if you can think of things that you can apply to lots of different contexts, including quotations and central ideas, it will really help you with your revision. So just a couple of ideas here. We've got Dickens hopes to illustrate how self-serving, insensitive people can be converted into charitable, caring and socially conscious members of society. So that is Scrooge. And he is hoping that rich people will see themselves in Scrooge. And he's showing that there is the opportunity to change. A Christmas Carol advances the Christian moral ideals associated with Christmas: generosity, kindness and universal love for your community and of Victorian England in general. So you cannot ignore the fact that it is set at Christmas and it's a Christian ideal. The book contains a political edge, and that's most evident in Dickens' development of the bustling but struggling Cratchit family, who are a compelling representation of the plight of the poor. And warmth, generosity and overall goodwill overcome Scrooge's bitter apathy as he encounters and learns from his memory, the ability to empathise and his fear of death. Now what I recommend you do, especially if you are looking for those highest grades, is start to think about how you can embed these statements into your essays, and think about where you can find evidence within your essay to support ideas like this. You want to be moving towards making big ideas work for you, rather than just simply exploring Scrooge as a character or the ghosts as supernatural. The whole point of this allegorical novel was to send a message to rich people that they need to change. So what I would suggest now is that you have your revision notebook in front of you, a highlighter, probably a copy of A Christmas Carol, because what I really want you to start thinking about is how you are going to link quotations to your big ideas. So I am going to run through a couple of quotations, but this video now should serve as an introduction really for you now. So I would keep your work out, keep your quotations out, and start to think about the central themes I've discussed with you with poverty, and try and find some more quotations to support that. So we've got the description of the Cratchit's house in Stave 3 here. They were not well dressed, their shoes were far from being waterproof, their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. So think about the fact now, this isn't Charles Dickens, this isn't Scrooge, this is the omniscient narrator. And how the omniscient narrator takes an observational stance, really, that we can see physically the Cratchits have not got the basic things. And this is sort of intended, remember, this novella was aimed at rich people. So we've got the idea that, you know, the shoes weren't waterproof. Obviously, on a literal basis, that means the shoes weren't good enough, the feet are going to get wet. But think about that sort of metaphorical understanding that these poor people are not protected from the conditions of Victorian London. A pawnbroker is somewhere where you would take stuff to sell. So obviously it's again that reminder. So through the Cratchits, Dickens reminds us of the struggles of the poor. And what you will be looking at is how the omniscient narrator observes these things about the Cratchits, but the Cratchits themselves are a symbol of spiritual wealth. They are together, they are happy, they are joyful, and they're a reminder of family. Now, this is a really frequently forgotten scene by GCSE candidates, but remember, in Stave 3, the ghost takes Scrooge far out. He takes him to the edges of society, and the idea is that everybody is celebrating Christmas except for Scrooge. That's the basic idea. But what I would like you to think about really is how Dickens is almost taking hold of the rich reader and forcing them to see areas of London and the surrounding areas that they would otherwise not have seen. Remember, he's tackling his view that the rich are ignorant. So he takes them to the miners' family who live in the bowels of the earth. Now that is a good quote, because think about bowels as quite a graphic description, really highlighting through setting there how unpleasant and impoverished the life of the miners are. They live in a cottage that's made of stone and mud, but they're gathered round a fire and they're a happy family in the main room. Again, showing us that physical poverty, spiritual wealth, and it really starkly contrasts with Scrooge, who is in his counting house. You might expect a richer person to be celebrating Christmas more extravagantly, but Scrooge isn't. Again, a symbol of that spiritual poverty. The description of ignorance and want is hugely significant in this novella, and if you haven't already considered this is a really good opportunity for you to consider how they are described. Now, think about the concepts of ignorance and want, the ignorance of the rich and the want of the poor, and Dickens uses these two children as symbols of the problems in society. So you would look at ignorance and want as allegorical symbols. So I'm going to pause, you're going to pause the video, read this extract, and I'm going to pick out a couple of things from it. So I think it's important to note that he's brought these children from the foldings of its robe. Now, if you think about that, the idea of the foldings, it shows that these children, these problems in society, are almost hidden. You would want to look maybe at the fact that the children are kneeling and clinging, given that sense of desperation, the sense of them almost being unloved. And what you will be looking at, I think, is the significance that Dickens chooses to present them as children, because these children are the future, children are the sort of the next generation, and also children are vulnerable, aren't they? You've got the juxtaposition of youth and age, and think about that kind of quite graphic, stale and shriveled hand pinched and twisted. You got those verbs that link to pain, and this really is Dickens showing us quite a horrific image that is intended to show the rich people the impact of their ignorance. There's lots of quotations here. Think about the fact that they're presented as monsters, and the idea of angels and devils, that juxtaposition. There's an element of religious imagery there with the idea of devil linking to the sin of the rich. And finally, not a lot of people know this quotation, and I've tried to pick some of the little known areas of the novella for you to have a little bit of a look at. But remember, when Scrooge dies, Dickens takes us to the neighbourhood of old Joe's shop, and that's where Scrooge's belongings are taken and they're sold after his imagined death in Christmas Yet to Come. Now, rich people would not have seen this side of London, and remember, Dickens has taken them through this novella. He's taken them and he's showing them the reality of London life for many. So this is the description of old Joe's shop. The ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half naked, drunken, slipshod, ugly. Alleys and archways, like so many cesspools, disgorged their offences of smell and dirt and life upon the straggling streets, and the whole quarter reeked with crime, with filth and misery. That idea of it reeking of crime with filth and misery is very sensory description, this, isn't it? You've got the smell and the dirt and the real vivid description. So I would be looking at this as how Dickens kind of exposes the poverty of Victorian London and shows the rich reader how difficult life was. So I would make sure within your quotation bank you've got some quotations from here. So just some key concepts to wrap up. Always remember that Dickens as a social reformer. You are looking at Dickens' craft, the author's craft, and the whole purpose of this novella was that he's a social reformer. He wanted change. And I think the phrase of him holding a mirror up to society will just help you when you're analytically writing about The Christmas Carol to maintain that sense of purpose. Because remember, Scrooge is a symbol of the rich, the Cratchits are a symbol of the poor. So just be careful that when you're writing your essays, you don't sound like you think almost like Scrooge is a person and the Cratchits are a real family. They are symbols, and it's Dickens' mouthpiece, basically. Now, you should be starting to form some central ideas for the novella. Think about your thesis statements and how for every theme you should have a big idea. There are going to be more videos based around themes like this, but it's really just pushing you towards that more sophisticated way of thinking about the text.